Dear colleagues and audience, welcome to attend Professor Timothy Williamson's 6th lecture at Wuhan University. Timothy Williamson is the Wickham Professor of Logic at Oxford University with research interest in philosophical logic, epistemology, metaphysics, philosophy of language, and metaphilosophy. He is a member of several internationally renowned academies, such as the British Academy, Europe Academy, Norwegian Academy of Science and Letters, American Academy of Arts and Science, Royal Irish Academy. He has several influential books, and in the previous lecture, he has talked about this. And today, his lecture will talk about his book, Modal Logic as Metaphysics. The following is the description of his book from the web page of the publisher. Okay, I just repeat this description of his book. There are such things as merely possible people who would have lived if our ancestors had acted differently. There are future people who have not yet been conceived. Questions like those raise deep issues about both the nature of being and its logical relations with the contingents and the change. In Modal Logic as Metaphysics, Timothy Williamson argues for positive answers to these questions on the basis of an integrated approach to the issues, applying the technical resources of modal logic to provide structural cause for metaphysical theories. He rejects the search for a metaphysically neutral logic as futile. The book contains detailed historical discussion of how the metaphysical issues emerged in the 20th century development of quantified modal logic. Through the work of such figures as Rudolf Carnap, Saul Kripke, it proposed higher-order modal logic as a new setting in which to resolve such metaphysical questions scientifically, and the construction of semantic logical theories embodying rival answers and their comparison by normal scientific standards. Williamson provides both a rigorous introduction to the technical background needed to understand the physical questions in quantified modal logic and an extended argument for controversial, provocative answers to them. He gives original, precise treatments of topics, including the relation between logic and metaphysics, the methodology of theory choice in philosophy, the nature of possible words, and their role in semantics, pure quantification compared to quantification into predicate position, communication across metaphysical disagreement, and the problems from truth-maker theorem. This book is influential and has many good comments about it. Due to time meter, I just only cite one review by Professor John Davis, published in the top journal, Philosophy and Phenomenological Research. Professor John Davis said that I'm inclined to say that modal logic as metaphysics is the greatest ever integrated study of the logic and the metaphysics of modality. It is almost certainly the most comprehensive. It is also, in my judgment, the most important book on the metaphysics of modality since the book on the plurality of words. This is a brief introduction of his this influential book. Okay, during the lecture, the audience can freely post your questions in the chat box. And after the main lecture, Professor Williamson will give his replies. Also, it's our pleasure that we have Interlocutor, Associate Professor Peter Finocchiaro from Wuhan University. After the main lecture, he will communicate with Professor Williamson. Okay, now let's welcome Professor Timothy Williamson, give his 6th lecture at Wuhan University. Okay, please.
Right, thank you very much. So we need to share screen now. And yeah. Yes, so I'll be talking about issues to do with the theory of necessitism and related matters in the metaphysics of quantified modal logic today, which is a somewhat technical topic, but I will try to focus on the kind of general philosophical issues which are raised by this, and not get too bogged down in the technical details. So basically, I'll be discussing my work on modal metaphysics, and also in the course of that, I'll explain exactly what the title of the lecture actually means. So modal metaphysics concerns the interaction between modalities such as possibility, contingency, necessity, and other modal and other metaphysical matters. And I've been particularly interested in some of the most sort of general issues of that kind, which concern the interaction between modalities and matters of existence and identity. So, for example, about the relation between possible and actual existence, possible and actual non-existence. And these kind of abstract structural issues, they arguably belong to both logic and metaphysics. So hence the title of my book, Modal Logic as Metaphysics, which came out in 2013. So some people think of logic and metaphysics as completely opposed disciplines, which couldn't overlap. For example, the logical positivists thought of logic as something good and metaphysics as something bad, and so they couldn't overlap. But on my view, there are quite large areas where what you're doing can be described both as logic and as metaphysics. And the sorts of principles of modal metaphysics that we're interested in, many of them can be precisely articulated in formal languages of quantified modal logic, which, I mean, they start with a language of quantified logic, some of them just with the ordinary language of first order logic, some will be higher order logics, as we'll see later. And then they add to that, well, typically operators for possibility, which is expressed by the diamond, and necessity, which is expressed by the box. I mean, there are other modal operators which can also be added when we want to express a bit more in these languages, but it's the diamond and the box that are the most common and central ones. So following the work of Saul Kripke, the formal semantics for such languages is typically done in terms of what can be regarded as possible worlds, although when you're doing it formally, you're just dealing with a set of entities. But from the outside, we can motivate what we're doing by thinking of these as possible worlds. So just to throw in a little bit of autobiography about how I came to this. So already as an undergraduate, I was interested in modal metaphysics and quantified modal logic, especially through Kripke's work. But for a long time, I didn't really work on such matters. I didn't write about them or do research on them because I thought that really that these issues had been adequately explored by Kripke and others, and there wasn't really anything very much, as it were, still remaining to be done. But then in the late 1980s, I started thinking about a kind of asymmetry in the way that standard quantified modal logic treats identity and existence. So this was something where I started to worry that there was still something that hadn't really been properly understood. So if you look at what philosophers would treat as the standard quantified modal logic, the standard logic for dealing with issues about possibility and quantification, about generality and so on, it treats identity and non-identity as necessary. It rejects contingent identity. So it treats the formula saying that if you have some things X and Y, that the formula that says that it's possible that X is identical with Y and it's possible that X is not identical with Y is a contradiction. And of course, what we're talking about here is possibility in the sense of what really could have been the case. I mean, sometimes you might not know whether X is Y or not, but in some sense. But what we're talking about here is what could actually have been the case, and in standard logic there are proofs which show that if X and Y are identical, then it's necessary that they're identical, and if they're distinct, if they're not identical, then it's necessary that they're distinct. There are some little complications here. I mean, for example, we need to, in order to get the result of distinctness, you have to add a little bit of extra logic. That's not so easy to prove, but it's still the when we're talking about metaphysical possibility and necessity, that I think the proofs are pretty compelling. And so since one or other of the identity or the distinctness is necessary, saying that they're both possible is a contradiction. I mean, there are what you might think of as apparent counter examples to that, but they don't really refute that claim. But standard quantified modal logic does not treat existence and non-existence as necessary. So it accepts contingent existence, so that it says that the formula that says it's possible that X exists and it's also possible that X does not exist, that is not treated as logically inconsistent. So for existence, as contingency is allowed, but for identity, it isn't in the sense that I've explained. And Kripke had explained clearly why apparent examples of contingent identity are not genuine. Why there's some kind of illusion of contingency involved. But I wondered whether apparent counterexamples of contingent existence were really genuine, because, of course, identity and existence are not exactly the same. Well, they're certainly not the same thing. Identity is a relation, whereas existence is a property. But they both have the same kind of very general structural quality, and so, if contingent identity is an illusion, if that kind of structural matter is something that's non-contingent, then you might feel it would give a more unified picture if existence were also a non-contingent matter. Well, just to summarize that, identity and existence seem to be broadly logical structural matters of the same kind. So treating them asymmetrically looks anomalous. So before we go on and confront this issue in more detail, I'm going to clarify the terminology a bit. This is something I've already hinted at. By possible, I mean metaphysically possible, not epistemically possible. I'm not talking about what's compatible with what people know. I'm talking about what could have been the case. And so I'm basically talking about, when I'm talking about metaphysical modality and possibility, I'm talking about, as I understand it, the most general kind of objective possibility, not about anyone's knowledge or belief. And so I use necessity from metaphysical necessity and contingent for metaphysical contingent as well. And by I exist, I simply mean to be something in the most general sense. So for clarity, I will use the word be rather than exist. So some people want to make a distinction between being and existence, but they want to require something more of existence. For example, they might say that to exist is it's not enough just to be something. You have to be something concrete. But that is not how I'm going to be using the word exist. Or well, I'm not going to be using it very much. But in the ways I've used it before, I have not been talking about being concrete or anything like that. I've been simply talking about being something, because that is, from a logical point of view, that is the most fundamental sense of being, and so that's the one that it makes most sense to investigate in this general logical way. If we were talking about just about being concrete, we would need to investigate that in a more specific way, because the notion of concreteness is not a particularly logical notion. So, and in both cases, with the case of the idea of possibility and with the idea of being, because I'm taking those in the most general sense that one can, I think that maximizes the logical interest of these terms. I mean, the more general they are, the more likely they are to have interesting logical structure. So let's just consider an apparent example of contingency in being, because it's certainly the case that when you first start thinking about these matters, there seems to be a lot of contingency in being. So I'm going to talk about a kind of slightly hypothetical case, but just to make the sort of general structure of what's going on fairly clear. So let's suppose that that there are exactly n particles of some type T, where n is at least one. So there's at least one of these particles. I mean, we could be talking about protons or quarks or whatever. It doesn't really matter. We just suppose that we're talking about some particles, some type of particle. And so I'm going to call these T particles just for short. And So although in fact there are exactly n of them, there could have been more, say n plus 1. That, as it were, it seems completely metaphysically possible that there could have been more, for example, more protons than there actually are. I mean, the laws of nature don't specify any particular number that has to be the number of protons. And so if there could have been more T particles, there could have been a T particle that actually is not. As it were, it could have had being, but in the actual world, our world, it doesn't have being. So not being doesn't entail necessary not being. And in the background of what I've been saying, I'm kind of assuming that matters of identity and non-identity of these particles that they're necessary. I mean, those matters are kind of relevant if we think about questions of how many particles there are, that then their identity becomes relevant as well. And but you can leave that in the background because the basic points don't really depend on that. But they're kind of, it's helpful to assume that just to get a kind of clear picture of what's going on. And yeah, so the fact that that these T particles don't have being in our actual world doesn't entail that it's necessary that they don't, because I mean there could have been some of these some more T particles, and similarly there could have been fewer T particles, just say n-1 rather than n, and as it were, one of the T particles that there actually is could have failed to exist. That was metaphysically possible. So there actually is a T particle that could have not been. It could have been nothing. And so that means that being doesn't entail necessary being. Because although this T particle is in fact something that on this view is not a necessary matter. So when you think about examples like this, it seems really compelling that what there is in the sense of which beings there are is not a necessary matter. So is there anything wrong with such apparent examples of contingent non-being and contingent being? I mean, these examples seem, they're certainly not as easy to dismiss as the apparent counterexamples that Kripke discusses of, for example, of the necessity of identity. I mean, these look like pretty good cases for saying that being is contingent. But there is another way of interpreting the example. But just to clarify before I go into the details, one thing that I should emphasize is that when we're talking about the contingency or non-contingency of beings, that is specifically a question about which individuals there are, which things there are. It's not just a question about what there is in general. I mean, for example, it's there are. It's a contingent fact that there are philosophers. There could have been no philosophers. It could have been that no creatures ever evolved with the intelligence to even start doing philosophy. The contingency of whether there are philosophers, that's something that is pretty much generally agreed, and I certainly think that it's contingent that there are philosophers. So when we're talking about the contingency of being, we're talking about something much more specific. We're talking about whether, for a given individual, it's contingent or necessary whether it has being. In other words, whether it is something. So that the example that I gave of the T particles, where it seemed that what we were dealing with is contingency in whether these T particles have being, can be interpreted in a different way. So we can agree that there could have been more T particles, say n+1, but on this alternative view, if there could have been more T particles, then that would just mean that there could have been a T particle that actually is a merely possible T particle. So this, as it were, extra T particle, which is not in our actual world, but is in some other counterfactual world, it's not in our world as a T particle, but it is in our world. And so it's actually something, but just not a T particle. It's a possible T particle, i.e., it could have been a T particle, and that would be a bit like an example where imagine somebody who in our world never hears about philosophy, never does any philosophy, never thinks any philosophical thoughts. So they're not a philosopher, but they could have been a philosopher. And so they're they're, if you like, a possible philosopher in the sense of something that could have been a philosopher. And here we're talking about something that could have been a T particle, but isn't actually a T particle. And so it's just what it actually is just a possible T particle. And in fact, this would presumably means that this thing that could have been a T particle, it doesn't even have spatio-temporal location. It's not in space and time. But if it had been a T particle, it would have been in space and time. And so it's just, if you like, a point of potentiality, but that point is actually present in the actual world. It's something in the actual world that has no location, but could have had a location. And we can give a corresponding interpretation of the possibility that there could have been fewer T particles, just say n-1 rather than n. And what that would mean is that there is a T particle that could have been a merely possible T particle. And it would still have been something, but not a T particle, just a possible T particle. So, imagine that we, as it were, let's pretend that we have a T particle in front of us now. And perhaps we do. And so it's in space and time, and it is a T particle, but there could have been no such T particle, in the sense that you could have had a space-time that this object wasn't in. But that doesn't have to mean that it would simply have been nothing whatsoever. It could have been, in those circumstances where it's not a T particle, a possible T particle. And so if you interpret the example like that, the number of T particles is contingent, just as the number of philosophers is a contingent matter. But that does not mean that it's contingent which entities there are, which beings there are. because as it were, that purely structural property would, on this alternative interpretation, would be non-contingent. All that's contingent is whether these given individuals, which, as it were, are there in all possible worlds, whether they have the property of being a T particle, and it's also contingent whether they have the property of being in space and time, for example. So, again, just to summarize, that on such a view, being and not being are non-contingent properties. The contingent properties are being a T particle and not being a T particle. And so this principle that being and not being are necessary, non-contingent properties, that's what I mean by necessitism, that being itself is a necessary matter, not that everything is necessary. And the kind of account that I've just given for the case of T particles, it can be generalized to other possible apparent counterexamples to necessitism. I mean, there's a fairly general kind of procedure here for reinterpreting such apparent counterexamples in a way that's consistent with necessitism. And of course, unsurprisingly, the negation of necessitism is contingentism. And this is something I'm not going to talk about very much in the lecture, but there is a kind of temporal analog of necessitism, which I call permanentism, which says that being and not being are permanent, that they're non-changing properties. All sorts of other properties may be changing, but being and not being themselves are permanent. And then the negation of permanentism would be temporaryism. So and that would, I mean, permanentism and temporaryism would be relevant in cases where it seemed, they're relevant actually to questions of death, for example, that whether after someone's death they cease to be anything at all, or whether they merely cease to be alive, cease to be a person, cease to have a spatial location, and so on. And from a purely structural point of view, the kinds of question that I'll be discussing about necessitism and contingentism, about modality, the considerations have analogous considerations in the case of the temporal analog for as it were, time rather than possibility. That doesn't automatically mean that if you're a necessitist about one, you have to be a permanentist, or that if you're a permanentist, you have to be a necessitist. Because it might be that the whole analogy between possibility and time is not as good an analogy as you might think. And so, for example, some people hold that Einstein's theory of special relativity, on which there is, for example, there's no privileged, there's no such thing as the privileged present, because the idea of the present as extending beyond a single spatio-temporal point has no absolute meaning. And so you could be a necessitist but think that that there isn't really a good analogy between time and modality, or you could also be a permanentist and just think that the analogy between time and modality doesn't work, and so not be a necessitist. So that it's not that you have to take the same line on both of these, but it's worth remembering that the issues that I'm talking about, you can construct temporal analogues of most of what I will be saying. I'm not going to be doing that. I'm going to be focusing on the modal issues of contingency and non-contingency. But you could talk about time, and I do talk a bit about time in the book, in Modal Logic as Metaphysics, but mostly what I'm talking about is modality. So one nice feature of Necessitism is that it simplifies modal logic and metaphysics, and permanentism has the same feature, that it simplifies temporal logic and metaphysics. And so just to say a very little bit about how that works. So if we're going to be doing possible worlds semantics, where we're using models, where each model has a set of worlds which you can think of as possible worlds. I mean, the sort of models that Saul Kripke introduced. So Necessitism corresponds to what's called constant domain semantics, where any two worlds in a given model must have the same domain of individuals. So as we're each in these models, each world is associated with a domain of individuals, which are what there are in that world. And with Necessitism, that would be the same for all worlds. Whereas contingentism corresponds to what's called variable domain semantics, where two worlds in a given model may have different domains of individuals associated with them. And that's as it were how you kind of translate the issues of Necessitism and contingentism into possible world semantics. So Necessitism also, in terms of the language of quantified modal logic, it validates two famous axiom schemas, which are actually, they're named after Ruth Barkin, Marcus, the American logician, who was the first person to publish these formulas. So there's what's called the Barkin Formula, which says that if there could be something that is F, then there is something that could be F. So just to give an example of that, I mean, the philosopher Wittgenstein had no children. So let's take f of x to mean that x is a child of Wittgenstein. Then what the Barkin formula says is that if it's possible for there to be a child of Wittgenstein, then there is something which could have been a child of Wittgenstein. It doesn't say that it is a child of Wittgenstein, it just says that it could have been a child of Wittgenstein. So, since clearly it is possible that there could have been, there's nothing metaphysically impossible about Wittgenstein having a child. So that means that if we apply the Barkin formula, we get the result that there is something such that it could have been a child of Wittgenstein. And then you wonder what that is, because it doesn't seem like any actual person could have been a child of Wittgenstein, because an actual person would have had different parents, and at least if Kripke is right, then having those different parents is a necessary property of that person, and it doesn't really seem plausible that some collection of atoms could have been a child of Wittgenstein, because it's not really the collection of atoms that is the person. They constitute the person, but they're not identical with the person. And similarly, the converse Barkin formula says it's just that if there is something that could be F. For example, if there is something that could be a child of Wittgenstein, then there could be something that is F. So, if the one thing that in particular this takes, suppose that we take F to be the property of being Tim Williamson, it says that if that there is something such that it's possible that that it's Tim Williamson, and therefore that it's possible that there is something which is Tim Williamson. I mean, of course, that particular instance is relatively uncontroversial, but if we took F to be the property of not being, then this says that if there is something which could have had not being, which could have not been, then it's possible that there is something which doesn't have being. And of course, saying that it's possible that there is something which doesn't have being, it's like saying it's possible that there is something which is nothing, and which is a contradiction. And therefore, what the converse Barkin formula it actually tells you is that it's not the case that there is something which could have not been. And so the converse Barkin formula in that way already gives you some kind of necessity of being, that whatever has being necessarily has being. So on necessitism, both the Barkin formula and the converse Barkin formula are logically valid. But if you take a contingentist view, then neither formula is valid. I mean, so in other words, those formulas, they're valid if you just look at constant domain models, but you can invalidate them if you look at variable domain models. And I mean, that's something which Kripke already studied in the early 1960s. Yes, so I mean, this is just kind of repeating what I've said there, and a much simpler formula that also captures the heart of necessitism. It is just the axiom which says it's necessary that that everything is necessarily something. So, in other words, necessarily everything has necessary being, and contingentists normally reject that axiom. By the way, something that I should mention for people who with an interest in modal logic here is that I'm in quite a lot of the discussion, I'm going to be simplifying things by assuming the principles of the propositional modal logic known as S5, and the really distinctive principles of S5 are that if something is possible, then it's necessary that it's possible, and that if something is impossible, then it's necessary that it's impossible. And so, as it were, what it tells you is matters of possibility and necessity are not themselves contingent. Now, I'm assuming, to simplify things, that is the correct logic for metaphysical modality, which is the one I'm talking about. I mean, there are some modalities that it's not correct for, but it's quite plausible that it's correct for metaphysical modality. That's not completely uncontroversial, and one can have a debate about those issues. But for for present purposes, I'm just keeping that in the kind of background as something that I'll assume, and that makes a lot of these issues somewhat simpler. But in principle, we could also consider what happens if we reject those S5 principles. So the correspondence between axioms of quantified modal logic and formal conditions on possible worlds models like Kripke's is a matter of mathematics, because we've got these models and we've got a completely precise definition of what it is for a formula of quantified modal logic to be true in one of those models, and the models themselves are formally completely precisely demarcated, and so just in terms of the connection between the axioms and the formulas of quantified modal logic on the one hand, and formal conditions on possible worlds models like Kripke's, those are purely mathematical questions, and they've been very intensively studied. And really by the 1980s, they were pretty well understood. I mean, it's not that all questions about them have been answered, but on the whole, the philosophically most interesting connections are well known, and it's the questions that remain to be answered are kind of rather technical mathematical questions, which don't usually have much philosophical interest. Some of them may do, but most of them don't. And so that was actually part of the reason why I hadn't been working on quantified modal logic, because I thought that so much had already been understood, that at least of what was philosophically interesting. But I actually found that the relation between axioms of quantified modal logic and informal semantics, in other words, our ordinary grasp of different senses of can or possible, or must or necessary, etc. And that would include the informal understanding that philosophers have of, for example, metaphysical modality, metaphysical possibility and necessity. The connection between that and the axioms of quantified modal logic was much less studied and much less understood. And so, what does it mean for for informally grasped senses of modal logic, of modal terms, to validate a formula of quantified modal logic? I mean, you see, the thing is that we've got this formal semantics for the language of quantified modal logic, which enables us to evaluate all the formulas as true or false at mathematically well-defined models. But we can also take the formulas of quantified modal logic, of that formal language, and simply read them in English as expressing some philosophically interesting ideas. So without using the formal semantics, so that I was doing that when I was talking about the formula that you see there, the necessitist formula. I wasn't talking about how it works in a formal Kripke model or something like that. I was simply reading it as necessarily everything is such that necessarily something is identical with it, which one can abbreviate as necessarily everything is necessarily something. So there, I'm really just connecting the formula directly with a sentence of English which expresses a philosophically interesting claim without going via the formal semantics. And this kind of question, I mean, it also arises, at a much simpler level, even when we're not using quantifiers, for formulas like, if box P, then P, or if diamond P, then box diamond P to be valid. And of course, the first of those is saying that if necessarily P, then P, and the second is saying if possibly P, then necessarily possibly P. And so actually the second of those is the characteristic axiom of the modal system S5 that I was talking about before. Says that in effect that possibility implies necessary possibility, and the second of them is just the principle that necessity implies truth, which is at least when we're talking about metaphysical necessity is uncontroversial. But we'd like to say something a little bit more precise about what we mean when we're talking about a formula that is valid on a given informal understanding. And one thing to remember here is that the P that you see in those formulas, it's just a formal, uninterpreted sentence letter. We haven't given any particular meaning to P. We haven't said which proposition we want it to express or anything like that. And so we can't just directly say, that we're interested in whether necessarily, if necessarily P, then P, or whether that's true, because we can't evaluate that as true or false until we've interpreted P. So, the rough idea is that to be valid, the formula should come out true no matter what proposition the sentence letter P stands for, no matter which proposition we take P to express. That's really the most obvious thing to want as a requirement for validity for these formulas. And one thing to say here is that we're not just talking about a kind of substitutional criterion of validity where we're just saying that it should be true no matter which sentence of our language we substitute for P. Because that would imply a restriction to propositions that were expressible in a particular language, whatever our language happened to be, English or Chinese or whatever. Because we don't want a kind of validity that depends on accidental limitations on the expressive power of the language that we happen to be working in. This was a point that was already made by Alfred Tarski, the great logician in the 1930s in his work on logical consequence, that you shouldn't be using what's called a substitutional account, where you just look at the results of substituting sentences in a given language for the sentence letters and so on, because that makes validity sensitive to what you're able to express in that language, and that's not a feature that we want validity to have. So we can express the kind of generality that we do want by quantifying into sentence position and writing, for example, something like for all P, if necessarily P, then P. And so if we just take the validity of the formula, if necessary P, then P, as equivalent, if we just take that as our criterion, then the validity of the formula is equivalent to the truth of its universal generalization. And that seems like the simplest and most natural thing to mean by validity in this context. You could also add extra requirements on validity, but they would complicate the picture unnecessarily. You might want to insist that that validity is not just that the the universal generalization is true, but that it's necessarily true, or that we can know a priori that it's true, or something like that. But I think adding those extra things just gives us a messier, more complicated account, and that it's better to focus, at least in the first instance, on the kind of simple, natural standard of validity, which is simply the truth of the universal generalization. And these kinds of criteria, these kind of considerations, they apply to quantified modal logic as well as to propositional modal logic. So for example, we were looking before at the Barkin formula, and its validity should depend, once we focus on a given reading of the diamond. Because I'm reading it as metaphysical possibility, but you could also have some other reading of it, for example, as physical possibility or practical possibility. But the validity of the formula on that reading of the diamond should simply require the formula to be true, whatever property the predicate letter F stands for. That's the one sort of non-logical bit of the formula. And it should be true whatever property it expresses in the most inclusive sense of property. Because after all, when we do if you think of we do want this to hold for all substitutions of predicates, but not only for those in a given language. The property doesn't need to be expressible by a simple or complex predicate of English or Chinese. But if we do have some complex predicate of English or Chinese, we want whatever property it expresses in a given context to be one of the properties that that we're considering when we see whether this formula holds for all properties. And so we can express the kind of generality that we want by quantifying into predicate position. And so we're writing for all F, if possibly something is F, then there is something such that possibly it's F. And so again, the validity of the Barkin formula is equivalent to the truth of its universal generalization. So the basic idea is exactly the same for those unquantified, it's the same as what we were saying about the validity of the formulas like if necessarily P, then P. Actually, there's one more thing that we have to specify here, which is how much generality we're assigning to the name position quantifier, for some X, the first order quantifier. So we have to say which individuals it covers, because until we've said that, we can't evaluate even the universally quantified for all F, blah, 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 because we haven't fully specified the meaning of there exists or there is an X. And in the present setting, since we're quantifying over all propositions and all properties, it's most natural to treat there is an X as quantifying over all individuals whatsoever. And I think that's the reading which is certainly of most interest if we're talking about metaphysics, where in metaphysics we often want to quantify with maximum generality. So on this approach, when we're supposing that a formula of modal logic is valid, but valid on an informal reading of the modal operators, as opposed to valid on some formal semantics, what we're doing is equivalent to supposing its universal generalization, with the same reading of the modal operators. Now, since the the universal generalization, that's the kind of thing that we've been talking about, since it normally involves quantifying into sentence or predicate position, as with the for all P and the for all F, and of course it will also typically involve modal operators. It's going to be a formula of higher order modal logic. Even if the original formula whose validity we were interested in was just a formula of first order modal logic, when we form its universal generalization, the universal generalization has to be in this higher order modal language. And so in order to understand informal validity in either first order or higher order modal logic, we need to work in higher order modal logic. And so that was one of the more general things that I was interested in doing in modal logic as metaphysics, which is developing higher order modal logic, which, I mean, not that I'm not the first person by any means to have worked on that, but as it were, to emphasize the importance of higher order modal logic as giving the kind of framework in which we can actually make explicit some of the things that we're really interested in, especially from a metaphysical point of view. And one thing to say about the kind of universal generalizations that we're using here is that they're not themselves metalinguistic or metalogical in any distinctive sense. They're not talking about language or about formulas. The universal generalization, it's just a higher order analog of a generalization about all properties or all propositions or something like that. And so these generalizations that we're talking about, they belong to metaphysics. So in studying validity in modal logic, we are in effect doing metaphysics, because when we ask, we take a formula of quantified modal logic, we specify what kind of modality we're interested in, such as metaphysical modality typically, but it could also be some kind of physical or practical modality. And we specify what reading we're giving to the first order quantifiers. I think typically we're interested in quantifying over all individuals whatsoever. And then the validity of the formula on that reading, informally understood, is equivalent simply to a universal generalization in the higher order modal language. And so that universal generalization is has this metaphysical quality because it's concerned with some kind of specific modality, such as metaphysical modality. It's not about language or anything like that. And when we're asking about the validity of the original formula, we're in effect asking this metaphysical question that corresponds to it. And that's the kind of line of thought which really explains the title of my book, Modal Logic as Metaphysics. That when we're doing modal logic, we can actually be doing metaphysics. They're not two separate studies, that they overlap in this way. Now, here's a kind of slightly technical note about how exactly this should be understood. Because instead of using higher order quantification into sentence or predicate position, we could have treated propositions and properties just as things and quantified over them in a standard first order way. Instead of saying for all P and then having P in the position of a sentence, we could, we have talked about for all propositions, and then if a proposition is necessary, it's true or something like that. So that would have been just as metaphysical as the higher order way that I preferred. And so it would not have undermined the book's title if I'd done things that way. And you could, if you wanted to, you could try doing them that way. By, as it were, first order quantification over entities such as propositions and properties. But there are severe disadvantages to doing things that way, because if you carry out such a reduction of quantification into predecomposition to quantification into name position. In other words, if you, for example, you reduce it to quantifying over something like properties, what you tend to get is analogues of Russell's paradox, and so it's better to avoid that. And the higher order way that I prefer avoids Russell's paradox because it's got this kind of type structure which basically immunizes it against Russell-style paradoxes. I mean, if you introduce various restrictions, you can do it in the kind of first order way by quantifying over such entities as properties. But then you have to restrict which predicates would get to express properties in the sense you're talking about, because otherwise you would have Russell's paradox. And then those restrictions mean that these formulas are understood in that first order way, that they don't really correspond very well to validity. And so the whole thing doesn't fit together as nicely as it does on a higher order approach. So in English, and maybe in all natural languages, talk of all propositions and all properties is kind of hard to avoid. I mean, there seems to be some kind of pressure in natural language to talk for generality to be a kind of first order generality. And so in speaking certainly in English, and I think maybe in all natural languages, what we seem to be involved in just that kind of reduction to first order quantification. But I think if natural languages really are so restricted, I mean, they may be have a few slightly higher order elements, but they mainly seem to be working in that kind of first order way. If that's what we're doing, if they're pressuring us to reduce everything to first order quantification, then we should treat that as a defect of natural language and understand higher order quantification non-reductively and not by translation into natural language, so that we're treating the formal language of higher order modal logic, so understood as the canonical language in which to formulate the relevant metaphysical claims. So we've got this formal language, but we're not just understanding it by some kind of model theory. We're understanding it by as an informal way, but we can't do that completely by reducing it to natural language, because that would force us into into first order readings of the higher order quantifiers, which don't really serve our purposes as well as they should. So given the kind of overlap between modal logic and metaphysics that I've explained, it's not surprising that I followed and defended some kind of abductive methodology in arguing for principles of modal logic, because the abductive methodology that I've talked about is really what we would expect to be using in the case of metaphysics. It's kind of analogous to the sort of methodology that we use in deciding between different theories in theoretical natural science. And so one thing that implies is that we should not expect such principles to be self-evident. So something might be a law of modal logic, even though it's not at all obviously true. And I think, as it were, requiring the principles to be self-evident would be, if in natural science we don't expect the laws of nature to be self-evident. I mean, surely the principles of not even the principles of Newtonian physics are self-evident, and well, after all, they're not, in fact, completely true. But certainly the principles of Einstein's relativity theory or of quantum mechanics, they're not at all self-evident, but they might still be laws of nature. And something similar goes in metaphysics and even in modal logic as a form of metaphysics. So what we should expect when we're evaluating these potential laws of modal metaphysics is that they should be as simple and strong as possible. This is what I mean by the abductive methodology. They should have unifying power, that they should be consistent with the ordinary modal knowledge that we start with. For example, let's say the knowledge that I could have overslept and not given this lecture if I'd been asleep in bed now, for example. So one thing that this brings out is that when we're applying this abductive methodology, we don't start from nothing. We start with that we already have quite a bit of knowledge of some kind of modalities. So, for example, I know that that in a realistic sense, I could have overslept. And of course, if there's an objective possibility of my having overslept, then there's a metaphysical possibility of it. So, I mean, that's just as it is with natural science, that when we start doing physics or chemistry or whatever, we don't start from nothing. We start already having a considerable pre-theoretic knowledge of the physical world, and then we start systematizing that and criticizing assumptions that we've been making and so on. And so we develop a long way beyond what we started from, but we still started with some knowledge of the physical world. And similarly, when we're doing modal logic as metaphysics, we don't start from nothing. We start from some modal knowledge and some capacity to evaluate modal claims, and then we just develop that by getting much more systematic and rigorous and critical and so on. So in that respect as well, that there's an analogy between the abductive methodology for modal logic as metaphysics and the abductive methodology for natural science. So, for example, applying this kind of modal this abductive methodology, in the book I argued for simple and strong comprehension principles, which are principles which tell you when you have, well, putting it in the kind of illegitimate terms of first order natural language, which they're principles which tell you when there is a proposition corresponding to a formula or a property corresponding to a predicate or something like that. And the principles that I go for basically say that every predicate modally defines a property or relation. Whatever the predicate in our formal language, in the kind of the language that we're using, it will define some property. So the properties don't need to be particularly simple or natural. And that's what we want for these principles to hook up well with the kind of the way that validity should work. And that was what I was talking about before, about why reduction to first order quantification is a bad idea. And the kind of principles that I'm interested in, they imply higher order analogues of necessitism, and so they abductively support my first order necessitism, because if we're going to be necessitist at all the higher orders, it seems natural to be necessitist at the first order as well. So that will give a more unified picture, and that's something that's abductively what we want. Another kind of consideration in favor of these strong comprehension principles in higher order logic, as we're telling us when we have properties and propositions, is that they're also needed to give principles in mathematics, such as mathematical induction and the replacement axiom of the Miller-Fraenkel set theory, which is, the standard framework for mathematics. Those principles get their full intended power from only if you have these comprehension principles. Because, the principle of mathematical induction, for example, it was often stated as a generalization over all properties that for any property P, if 0 has property P, and for any natural number n, if n has the property P, then n plus 1 has the property P, then it follows that all natural numbers have property P. And so that's the principle of mathematical induction, which is used all the time, of course, in mathematics. And we need predicates always to correspond to properties for that principle to work properly. Because if we had lots of predicates where we said there was no property corresponding to that predicate, then we wouldn't be able to apply that form of mathematical induction, and so it wouldn't really do what we need it to do in mathematics. And I think another nice feature of these strong comprehension principles in higher order logic is that they also provide a much better confirmed framework for discussions in metaphysics and philosophy of language than do traditional theories of universals. And often when we're talking about theories of universals, about whether there's such a thing as tablehood and so on, those discussions often seem to be sort of rather disconnected from anything else, and so they're kind of lacking in constraints that enable us to settle the issues. But if we think of the problem, things like the problem of universals or the analog of that in terms of higher order logic, then we have far more constraints, because we know how higher order logic needs to work, because it needs to be the background logic for certain kinds of mathematical theory, and so those put all sorts of constraints on what kind of theory of properties, as it were, we're dealing with. And so I think it's the very inconclusive and I think unilluminating discussions in the theories of universals. If we transferred the discussion to the framework of higher order logic, I think we're in a position to make a lot more progress, because we've got more constraints and more ways of testing hypotheses. So I want to, in the final few minutes of this lecture, I just want to briefly compare what I'm doing with the work of Quine and David Lewis, which may kind of help give some sort of methodological orientation. So, of course, one thing that's very obvious is that my use of higher order, well, I've said higher order logic, but I mean higher order modal logic, as a framework for metaphysics. It combines two of the things that Quine most disapproved of, in other words, higher order logic and modal logic. And it also undermines Quine's famous classification of, as it were, metaphysical commitments into what he called the ontological, which is to do with what the theory says there is, and the ideological, which is about what terms the theory relies on, what which, as it were, treats as making sense. So basically, Quine is saying these are the kinds of metaphysical commitment you can have: the ontological and the ideological. And And actually, in a lot of contemporary metaphysics, people go on using this dichotomy of the ontological and the ideological without realizing to what extent it's complicit in Quine's more controversial views about logic. When a higher order theory says something of the form, there is an F such that blah, 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 F, where the F there is something that occupies predicate position, then really the commitment of that the theory is undertaking is neither ontological nor merely ideological. The reason why the commitment is not ontological is because it can't be paraphrased as there is an F such that blah, 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 F, because there is first order. So basically, when Quine is talking about ontological commitment, he's insisting that we look at the first order quantifiers, that it's about to see what ontological commitments there are. So ontological commitment, in Quine's sense, is first order. Whereas if we have an irreducible higher order quantifier, as I want to use, then we're not getting a first order commitment. So it's not an ontological commitment in Quine's sense. But the commitment isn't merely ideological either. Of course, you could say, well, there is some ideological commitment, which is to the higher order quantifier. That's ideological commitment. But when you say there is an F and then something specific about the F, the predicate. So in other words, you fill in the dots. You get a more specific commitment than just the general commitment to higher order quantification. And so basically, higher order quantification is just as metaphysically committing, and it's just as much about reality as first order quantification, but just not in a first order way. So those are ways in which my approach in modal logic as metaphysics is quite anti-Quinean. But at a more general level, however, the methodology of modal logic as metaphysics actually does fit Quine's anti-exceptionalism about logic in Two Dogmas of Empiricism. Because, as he presents things in Two Dogmas of Empiricism, the methodology for determining logical theory is basically the same as for determining natural science and anything else. And so, at least on my view, that methodology will be abductive. And in a way, things that Quine says are kind of abductive. And so Quine, at least the Quine of Two Dogmas of Empiricism, the relatively early Quine, he's quite happy with that analogy between the methodology of theory comparison in natural science and the methodology of theory comparison in logic, and that's something that I'm endorsing too. So that as we're at a more abstract methodological level, there actually is something in common with Quine. One sort of follow-up that I wrote to the Modal Logic as Metaphysics that I wrote later is an article called Modal Science, which came out in 2016. Actually, in a volume of a special issue of the Canadian Journal of Philosophy, where there are a lot of essays reacting to Modal Logic as Metaphysics and my responses to them. But in that article, Modal Science, which is also there, I took further the application of the abductive methodology to modal metaphysics to reach more anti-Quinean conclusions. And I showed how modal logic enables us to extract the modal content implicit in many mathematical models used in natural science, in particular models of dynamical systems theory, which is a framework that the scientific framework that's used for chaos theory, for example. And it will apply to lots of things called phase spaces in science too. And the modal content I'm talking about, it's not metaphysical modality, but it's still some kind of objective modality, but a more restricted one. So these kind of scientific models that I'm interested in, they're based on a state space, which is a mathematical structure, which is understood for physical applications as a space of possible states of a physical system. So typically the scientists just talk about states, but when you look at what's going on, you see that what they mean are possible states that the physical system could be in. I mean, for example, it may be that it may just be a feature of the structure of the state space. In fact, it is normally that not all these states are ones that the physical system will ever be in. That can just be implied mathematically. So if we're talking about such a dynamical system, basically the kind of system that the scientists are talking about, but it also actually determines a Kripke model for a formal language with modal and temporal operators and quantification into sentence position in a natural correspondence with the intended interpretation of the model. So, one can read off the higher order modal commitments of the dynamical system from the sentences of the formal language, which are true over the corresponding Kripke model. Thus, modal logic is implicit in many of our best scientific models. And I mean, when I was writing that article, and I wanted to give the rules for reading off the modal formulas, for interpreting the modal formulas over the dynamical system, for turning it into a Kripke model. I was amazed at how easy it was, how natural and simple the correspondence was between the dynamical system, which is just the thing that the scientists are talking about, and a corresponding Kripke model. They're incredibly closely related. You don't have to do much work to get from one to the other. So those are some comments about my relation to Quine, and in particular about with the last part about, Quine wanted our metaphysics to be based on our best scientific theories, but our best scientific theories often involve these dynamical systems and other kinds of phase spaces. And so that our best scientific theories are themselves implicitly modal, which so as it were, Quine was recommending that we follow our best scientific theories, and it was also anti-modality, but our best scientific theories are pro-modality. That's a quick way of saying it. So I also want to say something very briefly about the relation of modal logic as metaphysics to David Lewis's work, and actually you can understand, although you might not expect it, you can understand David Lewis's modal realism, his distinctive view of modal logic, of modal metaphysics, as an application of Quinean methodology in a way that Quine himself didn't like, but it was still an application of Quine's methodology. And he was an application of it to modal logic, especially on Lewis's book On the Plurality of Worlds, which came out in 1986. And I think it's quite relevant that Quine was in fact Lewis's PhD supervisor, so that he was actually using Quine's methods to get to conclusions that Quine didn't like. And so Lewis respects Quine's preference for first-order non-modal logic and the ontology of mathematics and physics by using his counterpart theory to reduce quantified modal logic to first-order non-modal logic. So in that respect, he's much closer to Quine than I am, because he's trying to reduce the quantified modal logic to first order, to non-modal logic, to, as it were, reduce the modal operators. And he treats possible worlds as maximal connected concrete spatio-temporal systems, with all of which are equally real. That's the Lewis's modal realism, and why his view is so controversial, or some people would say crazy, because it's committed to all these other other worlds, which are just as real as ours, but it's simply that we're not spatio-temporally connected to them, roughly. So the reason that I rejected Lewis's modal realism in the book is because it is in effect a rival to cosmological theories in physics. It's an alternative theory of the global structure of spatio-temporal reality. So that, I mean, the question, well, what's the overall structure of all spatio-temporal reality? That's a question that cosmologists in physics departments are interested in. And they're asking questions about its structure. And then Lewis is also telling us something about its structure. He's telling us about how it has this kind of disconnected structure with all these different spatio-temporal systems, or kind of systems with something like space-time in them. And so he's giving a theory of the same subject matter as cosmologists in physics. It's just that I think that they have much stronger evidential support for their theories than Lewis has for his. And so, I mean, the support for those cosmological theories may not be very good, but I think it's better than there is for Lewis's view. And so as we're going to be doing cosmology in that sense, I think we should probably be doing it with the physicists rather than doing it with David Lewis. And that's why I reject his modal realism. Whereas, of course, the kind of necessitist theory that I'm going for, it doesn't have any kind of implications like that. So I'd like to end the talk by just mentioning a good area for further research by philosophers, particularly philosophers who know more natural science than I do, which is not very difficult to do. And that would be exploring in much more detail and depth the modal dimension, which is implicit in many, many natural scientific models and theories. So, I mean, I took the dynamical systems, and you can extract and just from a fairly elementary presentation of what they are mathematically, I could extract these Kripke models. But I think that there's much, much more work to be done in that area, using the same very general approach, but I think with much more scope to relate it to the interesting things that are going on in the science, and so that strikes me as an area for a lot of interesting constructive work that I don't really feel it in a position to do, because I think it needs to be done by people with a deeper and more detailed understanding of the natural science than I have. But I'm pretty sure that work will be quite rewarding. And so I'll stop there, and I'll stop sharing my screen.
Okay, let's first select speaker for this wonderful lecture. Okay, it's very clear and well organized, and it's insightful with many. We have enough time for our question and answer. For this moment, it's our pleasure to introduce the interlocutor of this lecture, Peter Finocchiaro. He is an associate professor at Wuhan University since September 2018. He earned his PhD in the University of Notre Dame in USA. Peter's primary research interests lie within metaphysics, especially topics related to the methodology of metaphysics, also called metaphysics. Peter also works on some topics in social philosophy. Okay, now it's Peter's time to.
Cool. I hope everyone can hear me well. Yeah, sure. I have a lot of questions. This was a very good lecture, and I think the topic itself is very interesting. I'm going to try to ask questions in a way that is helpful for the audience. Otherwise, I will just ask questions for hours. So maybe the first question to start with is this idea that you kind of gave at the end against Lewis's modal realism. And the argument is something like there's a conflict or there's a rivalry between Lewis's theory of modal realism and the sort of theories that are developed by cosmologists. And insofar as we should favor one of those or the others, we should favor the cosmologist. And the rivalry is grounded in the fact that they are giving rival theories of the same subject matter. And so the first question is if you could say a little bit more about what counts as being of the same subject matter, and like how precise that is and how fine-grained or how coarse-grained. Oh, Tim, you're muted right now. Sorry.
Yeah. So I think, I'm not going to, of course, there are some general theories about subject matters, but I'm just answering the question in a more informal way. As I understand it, many of the cosmologists would simply describe their subject matter as the global, or at least part of their subject matter as the global structure of space-time, and space-time not simply meaning, and as it were, the spatiotemporal locations that are connected to ours, because they're perfectly happy to entertain hypotheses about, there being other space times and which are disconnected from ours and so on. So then they're not imposing any kind of connectedness requirements. And so, I think if you described what Lewis was doing in a way that they could relate to, it would seem to me that they would think, well, yeah, he's talking about what we're talking about, and of course, it might not occur to, and then they might wonder, well, why isn't is not taking any interest in scientific observations or whatever, and it's not obvious to me why Lewis didn't. Why it didn't seem to occur to him that he was what he was saying was something that was relevant to cosmology. But I think in this case you could just specify what the subject is as the overall the global structure of spatiotemporal reality, and then given that specification, it's pretty obvious that both Lewis and the cosmologists are interested in it.
Cool. Yeah. Maybe a follow-up to that question. So earlier you mentioned that there's a temporal analog of necessitism, of permanentism. And it kind of seems to me that the argument you're giving against Lewis's modal realism, you can give an analogous argument against permanentism, insofar as it is saying something about, I don't know if temporal structure is the right way to phrase it, but they are saying something about the nature of time, or they meaning the permanentist theory. And so if they are saying something about the nature of time, that seems to also be a rival in terms of subject matter rival for other theories. So either the cosmologist or maybe like an Einsteinian physicist or something like that. So I guess two parts. One, would you agree that that is a rivalry? And if so, do you think the evidence is like more indecisive in that case, or what?
Well, so, of course, I mean, permanentism, in the sense that I was talking about it, is in a way it tells you a lot less than Lewis's modal realism, and it's so. I mean, I agree that it is talking about temporal reality, and that is something that that physical theories are talking about. And I mean, my own view is that physical theories in general are kind of pretty much take permanentism for granted, because they're when the scientists quantify, they're quantifying overall. Their quantifiers are not restricted to any one time or even any one region of space-time or anything like that. I mean, they're just automatically quantifying over all times, and so and as it were, restricted quantification of the kind that a temporiest would take. It doesn't play any role in their theory. So I think it's as it would be the temporists rather than the permanentists who would have something to fear from that connection. I mean, of course, I think that the permanentist temporiest debate, it's much more interesting if you have some kind of more realist view about tense, and when you take the tense operators really seriously. But of course, I think that but such views, I mean, they're definitely somewhat under threat from special relativity. I mean, it's not a straightforward matter, but I mean, they haven't. I think, as a realism about tense has not succeeded in getting into any kind of comfortable reconciliation with special relativity yet, even though we might not be talking about strict logical inconsistency, and so I think it's it's only when we get somewhat more realist about time that those issues become kind of more interesting ones in the temporal case. But in the if we just take the kind of as it were the 4D sort of viewpoint that you get from ordinary physical theories, I don't think it's a threat to permanentism, but it just doesn't make permanentism especially distinctive.
Yeah, that might be right. I mean, not to get too far into the weeds of it, but I would have thought that the permanentism, insofar as it's committed to using tense operators, is more committed to a notion of the privileged present than a more Ted-Sider style four-dimensionalist or something like that. Maybe that's not right, but yeah. Maybe we can move on to some still methodological questions, but maybe on a different line of thought. So I take it one of the points in favor of necessitism and maybe permanentism as well is the simplicity that the system offers you. So I have a lot of different questions here because I think about simplicity a lot, but maybe a starter question is just, it seems like there's different kinds of simplicity. Simplicity can be said in many ways. And especially when we were just talking about David Lewis's theory, David Lewis also argued for his theory of modality on the basis of a kind of simplicity, in that case, a kind of ideological simplicity. So you're able to reduce the notion of possibility to whatever. So I guess the question is, what kinds of simplicity do you think are genuinely worth considering in theory choice? Do you have a broad notion of what counts as simplicity or a more restricted notion? And then maybe a small follow-up to that is, do you have any thoughts about how to compare these notions of simplicity. Perhaps there might be conflicts where one rival theory is more simple in one respect, but the other rival is more simple in a different respect. That seems to suggest that there has to be a way to measure or compare or weight these notions of simplicity. And personally, I don't really know how to do that. So I was wondering if you could help me.
Yeah. Well, so I certainly don't have a way of measuring simplicity. But I mean, I think it's worth saying, if you just look at what the natural scientists are doing, I mean, they're often very moved by considerations of, theoretical unity and elegance and so on. But they don't have any way of measuring those. I mean, they would be more able than I am to give you a formula for working it out. And so, and I think, I mean, of course, the situation that you talk about, where, as it were, in one respect, theory T1 is more simpler than theory T2, and in another respect, it's the other way around. I mean, it seems very likely that we will get situations of that kind arising, and so. I mean, this may seem a little bit abject, but I sort of feel, I don't think that we should be expected to do better than the scientists. The natural scientists can in making these comparisons. I agree that in many ways, Lewis's modal realism is a simple theory, and so I don't think that I would argue that necessitism is simpler than his modal realism. I think it's kind of a bit hard to make the comparison there. But I don't think that where it gives you any very obvious advantage. And particularly, I mean, the thing is with Lewis, he has his preferred language for doing metaphysics in, which is just a kind of ordinary non-modal first order language, and then there's what he says at the level of quantified modal logic, and at the level of quantified modal logic, things get very messy, but because of the complications of counterpart theory. But I think Lewis would certainly be within his rights to insist that the messiness has to do more with sort of natural language, and that if we're evaluating his overall metaphysical view, we should consider it in his own preferred language, which is the first order one. And so when I'm arguing, when I make the comparison between my views and Lewis's, I wouldn't make it. I mean, I wouldn't say that, as it were, the main selling point for my view is if you're choosing between it and Lewis is simplicity. I put more weight on the considerations that we were talking about before, that Lewis is in effect are trying to outplay the cosmologists at their own game, and that doesn't seem to me that a place we should get to. And I think when I think the simplicity is more relevant when one's comparing necessitism with contingentism, and there I think one aspect of simplicity, which is quite important in a scientific context, is really just how many sort of degrees of freedom that you're allowing yourself, and scientists are very keen on limiting the number of degrees of freedom. In other words, on limiting the number of independent parameters in their models, and then I think it's clear that necessitism has fewer degrees of freedom than contingentism, because although this might not be the best way of thinking about it, but if you think about it in terms of the corresponding models, then one extra degree of freedom that their models have is that you have to associate domains individually with different worlds, and you have complete freedom in how you do that. Whereas it's incredibly constrained with the necessitist models, and so in that respect. As one aspect of simplicity, necessitism is allowing itself fewer degrees of freedom than contingentism, and I think that generally speaking, if you can do things with fewer degrees of freedom just equally well, then that's more explanatory than giving yourself more degrees of freedom.
So if I understand correctly, in a lot of these theory choice cases, we can make, maybe crude is not the right word, but we can make coarse-grained comparisons or sort of have a more general sense of how theories compare on these different kind of criteria. But that doesn't entail that we have some precise standard that we can use to precisely measure something.
Yeah, that's right. And, and I think one quite important role that these matters of sort of simplicity and so on play is actually just in determining which theories we take seriously. So that there are huge numbers of theories that people would just laugh at. So the physicists would just laugh at a view which said, this you'd have to tweak this a bit, but roughly speaking, suppose somebody claimed that special relativity holds on every day except Christmas, and Newtonianism holds on Christmas day. That nobody's ever going to put forward that theory, and it would be. And I think we have the same thing in metaphysics. So that, supposing we were, concerned about, let's say, physicalism versus dualism, on mind-body question. We were taking both of those views seriously, but one theory that nobody would ever consider is that physicalism holds on every day except Christmas, and dualism holds on Christmas Day. Those kinds of theory, those kind of hybrid theories are just complete non-starters, and it's roughly speaking something on the along the lines of their ad hocness, their sort of gross violation of simplicity that means that we're not going to consider them.
And I have the question, Professor Tim Williamson. Actually, yes. I had philosophy students from Fudan University. If you remember, I have sent your emails, and I want you give me some interpretation of your interpretation of Barkin Formula. If you remember.
Yes.
Yeah, and I want to ask you some questions because I see some materials. You said there is this possible object, right? And your possible object can identify with some the positions of possibilism. In other words. They say that necessitism is a kind of the possibilism because you set some possible objects.
Yes, for me, all possible objects are objects. So they're not merely, but there are no merely possible objects. Because an object is just just any being, and so a possible object. If there is a possible object, then it's an object, which I think is different from what it's different from what possibilists say, because but it might be that I mean, you have to look at exactly what the possibilists have in mind, because what they might mean by a possible object is something that could have existed, but that doesn't exist. And they might be using exist not in my very general sense, but in the sense a bit more like that of, being concrete or being causally efficacious or something like that. And then it might turn out that possibilism is actually that their possibilism is compatible with my necessitism. But if they really think, so it's kind of hard to tell exactly how to match them up. But I mean, there are certainly considerable similarities between possibilism and necessitism, and it might be that possibilism involves some kind of necessitism when you look carefully at what they intend.
And I have another question, because I prefer to interpret Barkin formulas in the actual reasons ways, because we both know that actual reason is most attractive, because they can say the possible law is kind of the objective, right? Because if we have if we commit to some real object, we can modality. We can make the possible words. How to say that? Kind of more force to validate the possible word semantics. And I think the possible object is like some trace actualism, because a trace actualist, because you may refer some river end, right? It's a possible word because they exist, but kind of abstract things. You can ask question. You cannot ask questions how many river there are, but you can ask a question about how many river ever there been, right? Because I have read your paper articles in 1998. There possibly I think that you may have the actual reason in mind, if I say it right.
Well, the thing about actualism is it's very difficult. It's very unclear exactly what it's saying, because it's saying that everything is actual, but and actual just seems, what's actual is just, I mean, the actual world contains everything that there is, just by, well, that's what we mean by the, actuality. It's just everything. It's what, anything that is the case is actually the case. And whatever is actually the case is the case. And so to say that everything is actually something is really just equivalent to saying that everything is something, which is that's just a triviality of first order logic. And I think that when people were discussing actualism versus possibilism, really what they were interested in was having a debate about Lewis's modal realism, and and then possibilism. But by possibilism, what they had in mind was something like Lewis's view, and by actualism they had in mind something like a the denial of modal realism, and I think that kind of distorted the picture. By giving too much of a role to Lewis's view. I mean, I regard modal realism as a kind of very eccentric view that is not the appropriate topic for the kind of central debates within modal metaphysics. I mean, once we, as it were, accept a modal framework, then it's kind of unclear what possibilism versus actualism, what that debate is supposed to be about. And whereas I think the advantage of a debate between necessitism and contingentism is that necessitism is something that's quite easy to express in the language of modal logic, of quantified modal logic. Whereas actualism doesn't have any such expression. And so, I think some of the kind of things that people were thinking about were also in the debate between possibilism and actualism, all were things that are kind of relevant to the debate between necessitism and contingentism. But my feeling is that unless we're just having a debate about modal realism, the debate between necessitism and contingentism is just much clearer and better defined, and so I don't think it's just equivalent. It's hard to say that it's equivalent to the debate between possibilism and actualism because those are such unclear views when you're not specifically debating about modal realism.
This is actually a good lead into my next question, kind of a biographical or intellectual history question. So the Bare Possibilia paper that the student mentioned, that's published in 1998. And then 15 years later, we have the book. And then it's been 8 years since the book. And I was wondering what, if anything, has changed in your mind over those, what would it be, 23 years or whatever. It seems like the central position is more or less the same, like the metaphysics is the same.
Yes.
But my vague impression is that the methodology of the argumentation may be advanced over, especially in between Bare Possibilia and the book. I don't know if that's right, but
yes, no, I think that is right, and I think that even at the time that I wrote Bare Possibilia, I was still a bit more in the mindset of looking for just for kind of knockdown arguments, and I think you can see that even more, in a paper that came out in 2002, Necessary Existence. I mean, which is kind of, I mean, it's kind of giving a sort of deductive argument for necessitism, although of course all the work really is with the motivating the premises, and so it was when I was thinking about those arguments and that and just becoming less and less contented with trying to do things in a kind of sort of deductive way, and it just it seemed to me that it would simply be a much more open and kind of in a way more honest way of arguing, just to be quite explicit about the abductive stuff. And I think it was also, I mean, might seem like a smaller point, but when you give something in an argument in a kind of deductive form, and then you have various premises, and then you have to motivate each premise, you kind of have a separate discussion of each premise. And that doesn't really seem quite like the right way to do things, because the question is, well, how does what you're saying in favor of one premise fit together with what you're saying in favor of another premise? And so one somehow not getting the kind of the sort of integrated assessment in the way that would be appropriate. And so I think that was. I think you're right that the shift was much more in the methodology, than in the metaphysical theory. I mean, of course, there was also the shift to using a higher order framework, and that shift. Well, it was. I mean, some of it was because I'd been writing on unrestricted generality and in my everything paper, and which pushed me into a higher order framework in order to avoid the paradoxes there. But I think it was also that it was sort of feeling to me that it would be better to be discussing the kind of issues I was talking about in necessary existence in a higher order framework than talking about the ontology of propositions and so on. So that there were a couple of, so that was something else that was pushing me in that direction. But I think it was also not so much when I was writing philosophy of philosophy, but when I was, I had lots of debates after philosophy of philosophy was published about philosophical methodology and about theory choice, and I kept appealing to abductive considerations and actually thinking to myself, why on earth didn't I put all this into philosophy of philosophy? Actually, I really ought to have said much more about it, and so that was something that was also quite salient to me. So I think your impression of the how things changed is right. In fact,
yeah, that's super interesting. Thank you. I kind of. Maybe this is more combative of a question. So this idea, so it's not an idea, but you moving to a higher order framework for this book in particular. And so you had a slide previously where you mentioned this tendency we have, especially in natural languages, or at least in English. I think I'm certainly not competent enough to speak for Chinese, but who knows? Maybe for most natural languages, this tendency to sort of slide into thinking of things in a first order way. And so any sort of higher order or second order way of thinking about things gets translated into some kind of talk of propositions or properties or predicates or whatever, right? And you mentioned the idea that this is a defect of the natural languages. And just to be clear, I'm kind of sympathetic to that way of thinking as well. But here's a challenge that I heard at Notre Dame a couple of times. I'm curious to hear what you would say in response. So the way it works is natural language is all we have, at least in terms of intelligibility. And so if we have some formalism, some formal framework that cannot be interpreted in terms of natural language in a way that preserves the sort of like authenticity or like the way it genuinely is saying the way that things are. If we can't do that, if we can't interpret it into a natural language, then this formal machinery is at worst unintelligible and worthless, but at best something that is saying things that we just don't have access to. And so there might be this framework out there. It might, in some sense, be the right framework. Maybe it's saying the things that are actually true when it comes to modal metaphysics. But we don't have access to that because our only access point is through natural language. I don't know if you find that line of thought persuasive or if you have like a ready response to it.
Well, I mean, obviously I don't find it persuasive, but I mean, I think it's it's definitely a natural thought. So I think I have a couple of things there. One is, I think that, I mean, it's clear that we have modes of comprehension that are not reducible to natural language. When you think about things like diagrams in mathematics, that which are the diagrams, they have some kind of intellectual content, but it's not really content that could be translated, let's say in Euclidean geometry or something like that. You can't expect to translate such a diagram into natural language, but it's clearly, it's playing a role in an irreducible role, I think, in our understanding of what's going on. So I think that's, I mean, of course, diagrams are one thing and higher order languages are another, but I mean, but it's at least making the point that it's not as though natural language is all we have. And the other thing is, I think that the abductive approach is kind of applicable to questions of meaningfulness as well as to questions of truth. So that when we're it may be that I don't think that it's actually very common to descend into utter meaninglessness in philosophy, but we might not mean that the sort of thing that we think we mean or something like that. And so, I think that the right approach is to go ahead. Let's say go ahead with using a higher order language and using it without attempting to translate it into a natural language, and if there's something really defective in our understanding of this language, that ought to show up somewhere. I mean, it's after all, if you'd think, if, for example, again, just to yet again have the comparison, with natural science, if physicists were using some kind of notation that actually didn't make any sense, you'd expect that things there would start to be warning signs in physics of things going wrong, and I think you'd expect think if we started using some meaningless notation in philosophy and resting a lot on it, you'd expect things to go wrong. I mean, typically you'd get into contradictions or something like that. If you really were not, as it were, in control of the notation that you're using, you have to expect to screw up. And so if actually everything goes really nicely, and we seem to have, a working theory that pulls everything together and so on. It's just, on abductive grounds, it's incredibly implausible to say, well, this all looks fine, but unfortunately, sorry, but what you're saying is meaningless. I mean, so I think, as it were, I think when a theory, which includes a theory in some kind of, notation that isn't just natural language, it's being tested abductively, and well, I mean, one way of putting it would be that abductive evidence for its truth is also abductive evidence for its meaningfulness, because it can't be true without being meaningful.
Okay, I'd like to ask a question. Maybe I'm wrong, but I still like to ask. It seems to me that it is problematic that the proof of from X identical Y to necessarily that X identical Y by means of liability law for all X or Y. If X identical Y, then X is F implies Y is F. Many, several scholars had challenged the validity of this proof. They including me, they doubt the X is F. We cannot put modal property like necessarily a priori something like that into the place of F. For example, if X identical Y, then necessarily that X identical Y, then we can all use this way to prove that it is a priori that X identical Y, X identical X, then it is a priori that X identical Y. But Kripke himself think X identical Y is not a priori Y. It's not a priori. It is empirical findings. What do you think?
Yeah.
Buddhists also write a paper to doubt the proof.
Yeah. Yes. Well, so of course, Kripke, I mean, when you're talking about substituting in the context of a priori, then that's an epistemic context, and so that's a bit different from the context of modal operators, which are understood in some objective way, as with metaphysical modality. But just first of all, about Kripke, he in his paper A Puzzle About Belief, he actually it's in effect an indirect kind of defense of the substitution even within doxastic and epistemic contexts by by arguing that the principles that we use in as attributing modal and epistemic and doxastic properties are potentially inconsistent. I mean, this is what his example about puzzling Pierre is supposed to show. And so he, in fact, in that paper, he's actually in effect conceding that going from X equals Y to its a priori that X equals Y might be okay. And I mean, the thing is that as Kripke points out, it doesn't even have to be Leibniz's law that's the problem. I mean, it seems that you get the same kind of result just from considerations of semantic compositionality. So for example, an example which Kripke gives in A Puzzle About Belief, if you take the two English words furze and gorse, they're actually synonymous words for the same kind of plant, and so since it's a priori that furze is furze, just by semantic compositionality, you get that it's a priori that that furze is gorse, because when you substitute gorse for furze in that context, you're simply substituting synonyms, and so by semantic compositionality it shouldn't make any difference. But of course, people feel very reluctant to accept that it's a priori that furze is gorse, because it's not something, not everybody knows that furze and gorse are actually that it's actually the same plant, even though there's no semantic difference between the two terms. And so, I think with these doxastic and epistemic contexts, it is, as Kripke emphasizes in A Puzzle About Belief, it's very hard to know what's going on, but it may well be that if we treat them, things like it's a priori that as sentence operators, that these applications of Leibniz's law are absolutely fine, even in those cases. And that really what's going on is that the principles, the heuristics that we use for attributing epistemic and doxastic attitudes are actually somewhat unreliable, and we seem to be affected, but not just by the propositional content, but by the words that are used to express the content. And that if we were to give a more fine-grained account of the epistemic or doxastic situation, we'd probably have to start using quotational contexts, and say things like, well, people, for example, if we take the case of Hesperus and Phosphorus, that people know they know that Hesperus equals phosphorus under the guise of the sentence Hesperus equals Hesperus, but not under the guise of the sentence Hesperus equals phosphorus. So that we might have to start talking about having attitudes to propositions under the guise of one sentence, or an attitude to the same proposition under the guise of a different sentence. And so it might be that the kind of distinctions that we really need to make, these fine-grained distinctions, just can't be accurately made at the level just of propositional, attitudes to propositions, without some kind of relativization to the sentences under which these propositions are presented.
Thank you. Yeah. I think we have time for one smallish question for me.
Yeah, sure. Okay. Yeah.
So back to the decision, I guess, like choose the abductive method and how we apply it. So you mentioned when we are choosing which theory or modality to adopt, we're not starting from nothing. We have some sort of like intuitions or thoughts about what is possible or what is necessary. And I take it that's supposed to motivate your view as opposed to some sort of more strict view that says that, for example, nothing other than the way things actually went is possible.
Yes.
So sort of, I guess you could ask this very broadly, but I'll ask the narrow version. When it comes to modal intuitions like that, Why do you think that they are reliable or worthwhile into considering our choice of modal theory? So, of course, like we have this feeling that certain things could be possible or certain things are necessary, but why trust that? And in particular, why trust that as it relates to metaphysical modality? Maybe we have robust intuitions when it comes to other varieties, but why metaphysics?
Yeah, so I think it's very reasonable to say that the kind of everyday knowledge of modality that we have is largely about much more local forms of possibility, such as the kind of immediate practical possibility and that kind of thing, and there I think the answer is so that and there's a lot of reason to trust those beliefs, because and to take them to be knowledge because they're fully integrated with our practical engagement with the world. I mean that we a lot of our decision making is based on our beliefs about what we can and can't do, and these beliefs about what we can and can't do, those the possibilities there are not epistemic possibilities. So that these are, as it were, objective possibilities, but of a very a local kind. I mean, the fact that you don't know that you can't, your kind of ignorance of your powers doesn't give you powers. I mean, these are objective possibilities, and then I'm kind of relying on the view of metaphysical possibility as the broadest kind of objective possibility, to say, well, if we know that there's a practical possibility of doing something, then it follows from that there's a metaphysical possibility of doing something, and that kind of view of metaphysical possibility as simply the broadest kind of objective possibility. I take that to be pretty much stipulative. That's as it were, that's the kind of possibility that we're interested in, simply because it has this maximum generality, and so I think that we can actually, as it were, we can get from these kinds of local knowledge of objective possibility. I mean, knowledge of local objective possibilities to knowledge of broader possibilities. In the same way that that we can, maybe in terms of quantification, maybe we very rarely use absolutely unrestricted quantification outright. But if we know that there are trees, just in some restricted sense of there are, then it follows from that there are trees in an unrestricted sense as well, and so that's how I'd make the connection. By the way, I see that someone called 86157 has a last question. So maybe I should finally answer that. So the question is, if possible objects have essence. So yes, I mean, so I do, of course. Nowadays, people are less inclined to think of essence as a purely modal thing. That many of them follow Kit Fine in thinking of essence as something more constitutive, and I take it the point of the question is that if the very same thing is, let's say, a T particle in one world, but it is a merely possible T particle in another world, then what could be essential to it? And so I think that the point of the question is that we actually get we don't get a very rich essences. from out of necessitism, because so much is allowed to vary. So, for example, it's not an essential property of a T particle to be a T particle. It's not an essential property of a person to be a person. It might be an essential property of a person to be a possible person, and there might be, as well, in principle, there might be some conditional things, such for example, that that if you're a person, then it's essential to you that if you're in space-time at all, you're a person, or something like that. So we can get some kind of cut down essences, but I think it's absolutely right that that the kinds of essential properties that we can attribute to things, given that all essential properties are necessary properties of an object, is much more restricted under necessitism. That's absolutely right.
Okay, thanks for all the questions and Williamson's very detailed explanations. Okay, since we have very limited time, I have no time to ask questions. But I just found a very quick question about your Barkin formula. This formula is about the diamond and the existential quantifier. And based on your necessitism and the Barkin formulas is valid. That means that these two subformulas is equivalent. But we have, if we consider another operator, the box, and another quantifier, the universal quantifier. So we have 4 kinds of combinations. So it seems that for me that based on your necessitism, 2 kinds of combination holds, but another kind of combination doesn't hold. For me.
No, but the Barkin formula, I formulated it in terms of the diamond and the existential quantifier, but it has a completely equivalent form in terms of the box, the necessity operator, and the universal quantifier, but that holds under my view too. I mean, it's just I think it's the reason I only put the Barkin formula in that particular form was just because I think it's a bit easier to understand what it's saying when it's in that form, and it's kind of less obvious when you put it in the necessity plus universal quantifier form. But I'm equally committed to both forms, and I mean they are equivalent on the kind of modal logic that I'm defending.
Yeah, these 2 kind of combination they are equivalent based on your necessitism. For instance, to another combination doesn't hold.
Oh,
yeah.
Oh well, but I mean there are 1 or 2 slight subtleties. But if we just take them in the form of possibly there exists X and then some an arbitrary formula phi, that kind of form, then the equivalence of that form and of the other form, it requires only very, very weak principles in modal logic. I mean, it requires basically just the fact that the duality of the diamond and the box, that not possibly not is equivalent to necessarily, and not necessarily not is equivalent to possibly, and then the similar kinds of duality principles for the quantifiers. And it also requires that you can eliminate a double negation even within the scope of a modal operator. So but those are principles which you'd expect in pretty almost any modal logic based on classical logic. So I think the equivalence of these different forms of the Barkin formula is pretty uncontroversial.
Okay, I see. I answer what you say. You say to me, one is the philosophical cases, another is a logical cases. Okay, Professor Chen-Bo, you have a question.
I'd like to make an announcement. Because of some reason, Williamson's last 2 lectures were scheduled at Sunday night, not Thursday night. Please take notice of these facts. The last 2 lectures will move to Sunday night, not Saturday night. I will be the chair of that last 2 lectures. Thank you. Okay, bye-bye. Maybe.
Thanks for all the discussion. It's been really enjoyable for me.
Okay, thank Professor Williamson's lecture, and thank Peter, many questions, thank our audience. So we can look for all of you next Sunday. Okay, will be chaired by Professor Chen-Bo. Okay, bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.